Hello, good evening, and welcome to Prog Chattery 777. Well, Primus! That is the next band I'm going to chat about. This is my next video series. I'm going to be chatting about the albums of Primus, the words and music of Les Claypool. I thought it was about time I did something that wasn't based in the UK. And if I got viewers in the UK who are sad about that, well, I'm sorry. I'll get back to those bands, of course. But I had to talk about Primus. I'm a big fan of Primus. They are lots of fun, and it's kind of an interesting era, I think, that they come from, the late '80s in California, LA. I think there's a lot of really interesting freaky bands that were kind of happening underground in the late '80s, and that was kind of a reaction to the hair metal that had become so popular. You know, your Motley Crues and whatnot. And there's a lot of great bands from that era that came from LA, including Tool, Mr. Bungle, and even Red Hot Chili Peppers, although they, later went on to mega success, and they kind of, I'm not a big Red Hot Chili Peppers fan, sorry. But that's just it's an interesting era, it was, and, getting off topic here, it was actually, I think, Nirvana's success. I'm not a big fan of Nirvana either, but they did have a big role to play. I think their success kind of opened the door for bands like Primus and the Chili Peppers and Mr. Bungle and Tool to kind of, it opened the doors for them so they could get, more well-known and on the scene and such. But anyway, back to Primus specifically. They actually traced their roots all the way back to 1984, which is quite interesting. And the original guitar player was not Larry Lalonde, who is obviously famously the Primus guitar player. The original guitar player was a guy named Todd Huth, or Todd Huth. I say that wrong one way or another. And it was originally Les Claypool, Todd Huth, and a drum machine. That was the original Primus lineup in 1984. They were originally called Primate as well, and then eventually it became Primus. Claypool and Huth went through several drummers, couldn't really settle on anyone specifically, but they finally settled up with a guy named Jay Lane. And this is kind of the first stable Primus lineup. You got Les Claypool on bass and vocals, Todd Huth on guitar, and Jay Lane on the drums. Interestingly, Jay Lane was not there for the first recordings that Primus did, but he finally did get to be on a Primus album in 2011 with Green Naugahyde, but we'll talk about that in another video. This band, was making their name in the underground freaky LA scene, and working really hard, but didn't really happen or whatever, and so eventually Les Claypool decided to put the band on hiatus, and he went to join his old high school band, Blind Illusion, which at the time featured Larry Lalonde, and that's how those two met, and they got along pretty well. So they decided to reform Primus, this time with a different drummer, Tim Alexander, and that became the first Primus to release any material. And yeah, Larry Lalonde kind of came from an interesting background too. He originally came from a death metal band called Possessed. I'm not too familiar with, but I know that Possessed is considered to be very influential. They're the first kind of death metal band that had the real grunty vocals and the super ridiculous fast tempos and that. So that's kind of an interesting side note that Lalonde had that history before he joined Primus. And, Primus themselves in the mid 80s had that kind of funk metal sound. They weren't quite as eclectic as they would become. And a lot of that is on fine display on albums like Suck on This, which was the first thing they released in 1989. Suck on This, of course, was a live album, was funded by Les Claypool's father, and I'm sure he was pretty happy about that because it launched their career. I'm not going to be talking about Suck on This specifically, just because I'm going to stick with the main studio albums, and all the stuff on Suck on This is on the other studio albums as well, so, I may do a little video on that later on, but I'm going to start out with Frizzle Fry. That'll be the first Primus album I talk about. And yeah, they're just on the whole, Primus is a phenomenally interesting band, I think. Um, Musically, obviously, it's all about the bass, and Claypool's very, very distinct and unique style. I mean, he really attacks it. He's a very aggressive player, and he's influenced by lots of different people. Musically, like, yeah, he's spoken lots of great things about jazz legend Stanley Clarke. He's obviously influenced by the classic prog stuff. Your King Crimson, Peter Gabriel. Um, that's evidenced on Miscellaneous Debris, which is a EP that Primus did of covers. The Police, I think, is a big influence. Of course, Claypool would later play with Stuart Copeland, the Police drummer, with a band called Oysterhead, which I don't know enough about, but I will soon. um, the other thing that I think it's often overlooked, because obviously Primus has a very distinct image. It's a very surreal, bizarre, off-kilter image. And there's a really interesting kind of dichotomy with that. Is on one hand, you look at their album covers and you look at the band's stage presentation. It's very irreverent and wacky and silly, and on one level you can look at that and get good entertainment value, good simple entertainment value. It's music that you don't have to think about. And a lot of the music itself too is based on really catchy grooves. It's funky, right? It's easy to tap your toes to. Not necessarily commercial, but you can enjoy it without having to think about it too much. And of course, the other side of that dichotomy is Claypool's writing. I think Claypool's a very underrated lyricist. There's kind of the surrealism is still there in the lyrics he writes, but there's a great Americana to it as well. And you can really hear the Tom Waits influence. You can tell that Claypool's got a lot of respect for Tom Waits, and who doesn't? Tom Waits is a brilliant writer. I love Tom Waits. But that has kind of influenced Claypool's writing quite a bit, and it's not quite so obvious in like the really early stuff, like your Suck on This or your Frizzle Fry albums, but as you get later on into the catalog, you really tend to notice, he is a great folk writer. There's a great folkiness to his lyrics. Musically, Primus has nothing to do with folk, but it's the way that he writes. There's some great stories that he's put together. And of course, there's the social commentary and songs about seedy characters and whatnot. And there's also a great sense of humor. It still retains that great irreverence. So again, like I said, there's a dichotomy. On one hand, it's like silly and lightweight, but there's enough depth there. There's more depth to Primus than a lot of people give credit. That's kind of the point. That's the point of what I've just been rambling about. It's not, you can't just take Primus at face value and say, oh, ha ha ha, what a silly bunch of guys. Although obviously you can, but there is more to it for those who are interested enough to check it out. So yeah, it'll be fun to go through the catalog. Like I said, I've always been a huge fan. Like I said, I'm a drummer, and Primus has had some pretty phenomenal drummers. That's kind of the thing with the power trio, right? If you're gonna be in a band with just 3 people, you gotta make sure that everyone knows their stuff. And typically, any trio has been made up of phenomenally gifted musicians. Like look at Rush, look at the Police, and look at Primus. It's kind of like the Trinity, the Trinity of trios. You get Rush, they're the Canadian trio. You get the Police, which is mostly the English trio. And then you get the American trio with Primus. I don't think any of them have a lot to do with each other. I mean, Rush is probably the most universal. You can, they write songs to be easily digested by everybody. I guess you could probably argue that with the Police. Police are probably a little bit more idiosyncratic, and then Primus is just the extreme end of the spectrum, where it's very, very unique and surreal and bizarre and all that great stuff. Anyway, I think I've rambled on too long. But stay tuned. Stay tuned here for more Primus. Send me a subscribe, send me a like, send me a comment down there, all those fun things. And you will see me in the future for more Primus. Take care.